The air at the Henderson County equipment auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of diesel fumes, dust, and the scent of burnt hot dogs from the concession stand. It was late May 1971, and the sun beat down on the rows of tired machinery like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Men in sweat-stained seed corn caps stood in tight knots, kicking tires and talking low about crop prices, their voices a familiar rural murmur. I stood near the back, away from the chatter, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans. My name is Jedediah Stone. My farm, the one my father and his father before him had carved out of the Iowa prairie, was a modest quarter section, free and clear. My inheritance wasn't land or money, but a philosophy hammered into me since I was old enough to hold a wrench. Debt was a poison. It was a slow-acting venom that made a man a servant to the bank, not the soil. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Mort, was working his way through a line of rusty cultivators and a worn-out New Holland baler. My eyes weren't on any of that. They were fixed on Lot 47, parked off to the side like a forgotten monument. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6 bulldozer. 10 tons of faded sun-bleached yellow steel. It had belonged to old man Hemlock, who'd used it to clear timber up until the day his heart gave out. It was a relic from the 50s, with a straight blade, open operator's station, and tracks that showed more than a little wear. A dark stain of hydraulic fluid wept slowly from a cylinder seal, glistening in the harsh sunlight. A loud, braying laugh cut through the auctioneer's patter. Richard Sterling. Of course, he was leaning against the fender of his nearly new John Deere 4430, a machine so green it looked like it had been dipped in liquid emeralds. Sterling was my age, but we were men from different worlds. His father had left him 500 acres and a line of credit as wide as the Missouri River. Rich saw farming as a numbers game, a corporate enterprise played out on a dirt chessboard. He was the first in the county to buy a tractor with a cab, air conditioning, and a radio. He called it progress. My father would have called it an invitation to ruin. "Would you look at that?" Sterling said, loud enough for his circle of admirers to hear, gesturing with his chin toward the old Dozer. Hemlock's old boat anchor. They ought to just sell it by the pound for scrap. His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on me. A smirk played on his lips. "Hey, look, there's Jed Stone. Probably thinks he can put in his whole crop with that thing. Might be an upgrade from that old Farmall M he's still running." The men around him chuckled. I ignored them. I knew my Farmall. Knew the particular growl of its 4-cylinder engine, the familiar hitch in the clutch, the way the steering wheel felt in my hands after a 12-hour day. It was bought and paid for in 1951. It didn't owe a dime to anyone, and neither did I. Mort finally arrived at Lot 47. "All right, boys, here she is, a genuine Alice Chalmers HD6. She ain't pretty, but she's got heart. Powered by a 344 cubic inch Alice diesel. We're going to start the bidding low, boys. Where can I get $1,000? Silence. The scrappers looked at it, calculating the cost of cutting it up versus the price of steel. One of them, a grimy fellow from the next county over, held up a finger. 500, he grunted. "I got 500, now 6. Who'll give me 6? Mort chanted. Another scrapper bid 6. It crept up to $800, then stalled. The scrappers were done. It wasn't worth more than that in pieces. Mort's eyes scanned the crowd. $800 once, 800 twice. Sold for 1,000, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden lull. Every head turned. Sterling straightened up from his tractor, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. He thought I was just watching, a ghost from farming's past observing the present. Mort's face lit up. "I got $1,000 from Mr. Stone. Now who'll give me 1,100? Sterling, with that arrogant smirk, casually raised a hand. 1,100. He wasn't interested in the Dozer. He was interested in making me pay, in humiliating me for sport. 1,200, I said immediately, my voice flat. I had done my homework. I had walked around that machine for an hour before the auction started. I'd checked the undercarriage, the sprockets, the idlers. I had a number in my head, a hard limit representing the cash from 2 steers I'd sold last month, tucked safely in an envelope in my truck. 13, Sterling shot back, enjoying the show. 14, I said, my gaze locked on the auctioneer. The game continued. 15, 16, 17. Sterling was getting annoyed. This wasn't supposed to happen. The poor backward farmer was supposed to fold. I was bidding against his ego now, not his wallet. 1,700, I said, my voice unwavering. That was my number. The last dollar. Sterling hesitated. He looked at the leaking cylinder, the worn track pads. He looked at me, a man in dusty boots and a faded shirt, and his pride finally gave way to his sense of superiority. He wasn't going to get stuck with this pile of junk just to prove a point. He shook his head with a dismissive wave. All you, Stone. Have fun with your new toy. Mort's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Sold for $1,700 to Jed Stone. A quiet buzz went through the crowd. I walked to the clerk's trailer, paid my bill in cash, and got the receipt. As I walked back toward my old Ford F-100, Sterling stepped into my path. "What in God's name are you going to do with that pile of junk, Stone?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Gonna push your dirt around in circles for fun?" I met his gaze. "Gonna clear the back 40, I said. "The 80 acres of timber and swamp your dad always said was worthless ground." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even a sliver of respect, crossed his face before the smirk returned. "Worthless is right. You just spent $1,700 to play in the mud. I just signed papers on a new 6-bottom plow. That's a real investment." He patted the fender of his John Deere. "This is the future, Stone. You're living in the past." He walked away, leaving me standing there with the bill of sale in my hand. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool. But as I looked at that hulking yellow machine, I didn't see junk. I saw potential. I saw the embodiment of my father's wisdom. Old iron, paid in cash, was a tool, not a liability. It was a foundation you could build on. Before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks listening. Have you ever bought a piece of old iron that everyone else called junk, but you knew it had good bones? Maybe it was a tractor, a truck, an old welder your neighbor had left to rust behind his barn. Let me know in the comments what it was and what you did with it. I read every single one. It's good to know there are others out there who understand the soul of old machinery. Getting that 10-ton beast home was the first challenge. My little farmall couldn't dream of pulling it, and my F-100 would have buckled. I had to call Hank Miller, who ran the only heavy hauling service in the county. His Oshkosh truck and lowboy trailer cost me another $80 I hadn't planned on spending, further depleting my cash reserve. The sight of that massive rusty Dozer chained to Hank's trailer crawling down the county road toward my farm became the talk of the township. Cars slowed down, kids pointed. It was a spectacle, and I was the fool at the center of it. We unloaded it next to my barn, the steel tracks chewing up the gravel driveway. The moment Hank pulled away, the full weight of my decision settled on me. There it sat, silent and immense, leaking its lifeblood onto the ground. For 2 days, I just worked my other chores, circling it, studying it, like a man getting to know a difficult new neighbor. I topped off the fluids, cleaned out the hornet's nest in the battery box, and scraped a decade of caked-on grease and dirt from the engine block. The engine was the heart of it, an Alice Chalmers 344 cubic-inch diesel. Not a fancy engine, no turbocharger, just 6 cylinders of pure, honest torque. I pulled the valve cover, checked the injectors, and drained the old, sludgy oil. It smelled like burnt earth and time. I put 2 new heavy-duty batteries in it, bled the fuel lines until clear diesel ran from the injector nuts, and took a deep breath. I climbed into the worn steel seat, pulled the decompression lever, and hit the starter. The big engine turned over slowly, groaning like a waking giant. 1 revolution. 2. I pushed the decompression lever in. The engine sputtered, caught, and then erupted with a cloud of thick black smoke that billowed out and filled the yard. It settled into a low, loping idle, each cylinder firing with a deep, percussive thud that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. The sound was a victory, but the celebration was short-lived. I engaged the clutch to test the drives, and that's when I found the real problem. The right track lurched forward, but the left one just sat there. I tried again. Nothing. A cold dread seeped into my gut. I spent the rest of the day with pry bars and heavy wrenches pulling the inspection plate off the left final drive. The sight inside made my heart sink. It was a mess of metal shavings and thick, gritty oil. The massive bull gear that transferred power to the sprocket was mangled. Half a dozen teeth were sheared clean off, lying in the bottom of the housing like broken molars. The pinion gear that drove it was just as bad. It was a catastrophic failure. This was why it went so cheap. Old man Hemlock must have known. He'd parked it, and there it sat until he died. News travels on invisible wires in a small town. It flies from the co-op to the diner to the pews on Sunday morning. Within a week, the whole county knew. Rich Sterling made sure of it. I heard it second-hand from the feed salesman. Heard Sterling holding court at the diner, the salesman told me, trying not to make eye contact. Said your new Dozer is a boat anchor. Said the final drive is shot and you'll never find parts for a museum piece like that. Called you the most stubborn fool in Iowa. The old-timers at the co-op would just shake their heads when I came in. They'd look at me with a kind of pity. They saw a young man repeating the mistakes of the past, clinging to old ways in a world that was rapidly changing. My quiet determination wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as foolish, stubborn pride. I was becoming a cautionary tale. I spent the next 2 weeks in my shop, surrounded by the guts of that final drive. The bull gear alone weighed over 200 pounds. Getting it out was a brutal, greasy battle, fought with chain hoists, come-alongs, and every curse word I knew. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table with the parts catalogue I'd managed to find, the pages thin and yellowed with age, and a rotary phone that felt like an anchor to the past. I called salvage yards, dozens of them. From Des Moines to Kansas City, from Omaha to Peoria. The answer was always the same. An HD6? Lord, son, we ain't seen one of those in 20 years. Scrapped 'em all out. I was close to giving up. The Dozer sat outside the barn, a monument to my folly. Every time I looked at it, I heard Sterling's mocking laughter. I started to believe him. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I should have just cut it up and hauled it to the scrapyard myself, eaten the loss, and forgotten the whole damn thing. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, I got a lead. A yard owner in southern Missouri, a gruff old man named Earl, said he might have something. Got a whole HD6 out in the boneyard, he rasped over the phone. Got pushed into a ravine back in the 60s, engines seized and the blades bent all to hell, but the undercarriage might be good. Can't promise nothing. You'd have to come look yourself. The next morning, before the sun was up, I was in my F-100, heading south on the highway. It was a 5-hour drive, the old truck rumbling along steadily. Earl's salvage yard was a sprawling graveyard of rusting steel, acres of dead and dying machines. He pointed me toward a far corner of the property. It's back in there somewhere. Watch for snakes. I found it half swallowed by weeds and small trees. It had been sitting there for more than a decade. But as I cleared away the brush and got a look at the final drive, my hope surged. It was intact. It was a mirror image of mine, but it was all there. I spent the rest of the day in the mud and the heat with a set of heavy-duty sockets and a breaker bar, fighting every bolt. Earl used an old crane to lift the entire assembly, a half-ton of iron and grease, into the bed of my Ford. The truck squatted low on its springs for the long ride home. The next month was a blur of back-breaking labor. Working alone, I used my engine hoist and a dozen blocks of wood to maneuver the massive replacement drive into position. The bolt holes were off by a fraction of an inch. I had to use a Porter-Power hydraulic jack to spread the frame just enough to get it to line up. I fabricated new gaskets from a sheet of cork, carefully tracing the pattern from the old, brittle ones. I cleaned the housing until it was spotless, filled it with fresh, heavy gear oil, and bolted everything back together, torquing each nut to spec. I was a surgeon operating on a patient made of steel. My hands were permanently stained with grease, my knuckles were raw and bleeding, but I didn't care. Finally, the day came. Everything was reassembled. I climbed back into that iron seat, my stomach in a knot. I fired up the big diesel. It coughed to life, that same reassuring rhythmic thud filling the air. I took a deep breath, eased the clutch for the left track forward, and held my breath. The track groaned, tightened, and then with a lurch it bit into the dirt and pulled the machine forward. It worked. Both tracks pulled evenly, powerfully. A grin spread across my face, the first real grin I'd had in months. I wasn't a fool. I was a farmer. And my dozer was alive. That fall, after the harvest was in, I finally put the HD6 to work. But as I began my own project, the world of agriculture around me was changing at a dizzying pace. The year was 1972, and whispers of a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union turned into a roar. The Russian grain deal, they called it. Overnight, commodity prices exploded. Corn, which had been languishing around $1 a bushel, shot toward $3. Soybeans followed suit. A wave of unprecedented optimism swept through the heartland. The mantra from the universities and the government was simple. Get big or get out. The Secretary of Agriculture himself told farmers to plant fence-row to fence-row, and the banks were more than happy to help. With land values soaring and crop prices hitting record highs, farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly leveraging everything they owned to borrow money. Interest rates were still manageable, and the future looked like a road paved with gold. No one embraced this new reality more enthusiastically than Rich Sterling. He became the poster child for the modern aggressive farmer. He used his expanding equity to buy the 160-acre Miller Place that bordered his property. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 4430 for a brand new 4630, a monster of a tractor with dual rear wheels, a quiet sound guard cab, and an 8-track tape player. He bought a new Gleaner combine, the biggest one they made, and a fleet of new grain trucks to haul his bounty to the elevator. He was the golden boy of the Oak Valley Savings and Loan. His operation was a gleaming, efficient, and deeply leveraged machine. I saw the temptation. I felt it. With corn at $3, I could have borrowed money, bought the Thompson quarter section that was coming up for sale, and likely paid for it in just a few years. The banker called me himself, inviting me to his office, telling me I was underutilizing my assets. But my father's words were burned into my soul. The bank is a good servant, son, but a cruel master. I saw the high prices not as a new reality, but as a temporary gift, a bubble that was bound to pop. I used the extra income from that year's crop to do something unheard of. I paid off the last of my small operating note at the bank and put the rest of the money, a solid $10,000, into a savings account. I built a war chest while my neighbors were building empires of debt. I didn't buy new land. I turned my attention to the land I already owned. While Sterling was plowing under windbreaks to gain another 3 rows of corn, I was finally taking the HD6 to the back 80. That worthless piece of ground was a tangle of scrub oak, hickory, and deep-rooted rocks. A low-lying section turned into a mosquito-infested swamp every spring. It was land nobody wanted. The work was slow and brutal. Day after day, I was out there on the dozer, the roar of the old diesel engine a constant companion. The machine was a beast. I'd put the blade in the ground and the engine would lug down, the exhaust stack belching black smoke as the steel tracks dug in and shoved over 20-year-old trees as if they were weeds. I dug out stumps the size of small cars, piling everything into massive burn piles. I scraped the thin topsoil off the rocky clay hills and pushed it into the valleys, slowly, painstakingly, building a series of broad, sweeping terraces to control erosion. The biggest project was the swamp. I spent the entire summer of '73 digging. I wasn't just draining it. I was creating something. I dug deep, piling the rich black muck onto the surrounding ground, building up the banks. Slowly, a 5-acre pond began to take shape, fed by a natural spring I'd uncovered. It was a long-term investment, a reservoir for irrigation during the dry spells, a water source for the cattle I planned to run on the newly cleared pasture. People thought I was crazy. They'd drive down the county road and see Sterling's immaculate fields, mile after mile of perfect green rows planted by the latest and best equipment. Then they'd pass my place and see me, covered in dirt and sweat, on that noisy, smoky old dozer, reshaping a piece of land everyone knew was good for nothing but hunting squirrels. They saw Sterling as a visionary, a captain of industry. They saw me as a man lost in the past, wasting the opportunity of a lifetime. Sterling himself stopped by one afternoon, pulling his shiny new Ford pickup to the edge of the field. He got out and leaned against the fence, watching me work for a few minutes. I finally throttled the dozer down and shut it off. The sudden silence was deafening. "Still playing in the dirt with your toy stone?" he called out, a familiar smirk on his face. "Just improving the place," I said, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of a greasy glove. "Improving it?" He laughed. "It looks like a bomb went off back here. You know, I just closed on the old Miller place. That's another 200 acres of prime black dirt. Gonna have another 20,000 bushels of corn in the bin this year because of it. What are you gonna have? A mud puddle?" He got back in his truck and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. I watched him go, then looked out over the raw, sculpted earth. It wasn't pretty yet, but I could see what it would become. Pasture, water, life, land that would produce year after year without needing the perfect amount of rain or a mountain of expensive fertilizer. That evening, I worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I shut down the dozer's engine and sat there for a long time, the silence of the Iowa evening rushing in to fill the void. In the distance, across the valley, I could see the bright halogen lights of Sterling's new 4630. He was working late, ploughing under the stubble from his wheat crop to get ready for fall and hydrous application. His lights were like distant, restless stars, never stopping. A knot tightened in my gut. The talk at the co-op was all about $5 corn and buying more land before the prices went even higher. The bankers were smiling, the salesmen were celebrating, and everyone was convinced the good times would never end. But as I sat there on my old paid-for machine, looking at my paid-for land, my father's voice was as clear as if he were sitting right next to me. "When everyone is running to the feast, Jed," he used to say, "be the one looking for the exit." A storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones. I didn't know what it would look like, or when it would hit. But I knew that when it did, I'd rather be standing on a foundation of solid ground than on a mountain of paper debt. I climbed down from the dozer and started the long walk back to the house, my hands stained with the grease and dirt of my own making, my mind already planning the work for the next day. The boom years rolled on, a wave of green cash and diesel smoke that seemed like it would never crest. The mid-70s were a heady time. Every trip to the grain elevator was a celebration, the scale ticket a winning lottery number. My neighbors were trading tractors every 2 years, building new machine sheds that looked like aircraft hangars and adding heated workshops I could only dream of. They were living the new American farm dream, a dream financed by the Oak Valley Savings and Loan. I kept my head down. By the summer of 1978, the back 80 was transformed. What was once a tangle of scrub and swamp was now 40 acres of lush pasture, fenced with Osage orange posts I'd cut myself. My small herd of Hereford cattle grazed peacefully, their red and white hides stark against the green grass. The other half was terraced and contoured, ready for planting. And at the heart of it all lay the pond, my 5-acre reservoir, its surface like a dark mirror reflecting the vast Iowa sky. The old HD6 dozer sat parked on the dam I'd built. Its work mostly done, a silent yellow monument to 3 years of relentless labor. The first sign of trouble wasn't a headline in the paper or a number on the commodity ticker. It was the sky. The summer of 1979 started dry and stayed that way. The clouds that gathered on the horizon were thin and wispy, promising nothing. By July, the corn in the fields began to show the strain. The broad green leaves started to curl inward during the heat of the day, a plant's desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They looked like tightly rolled cigars. The ground, that rich black Iowa loam, turned to concrete, cracking in jagged patterns between the rows. My own corn suffered along with everyone else's. But on the new ground, I had an advantage. I bought a used PTO-driven irrigation pump and ran a long pipe down to the pond. 3 nights a week, the steady chug of my old Farmall M echoed across the valley as I pumped thousands of gallons of water onto 20 acres of my highest, driest ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was survival. Sterling's operation, sprawling across nearly 1,000 acres, was utterly dependent on the grace of God and the summer rains. He had no way to water that much land, I'd see him driving the county roads in his air-conditioned pickup, a worried look creasing his face as he surveyed his wilting empire. His yields were going to be cut in half, maybe more, but his payments to the bank, calculated on the expectation of 200 bushel corn, were not. The breaking point came in August. I was cultivating my soybeans when I saw Sterling's magnificent John Deere 4630 sitting dead in the middle of his field, a cloud of oily blue smoke hanging over it. A day later, the dealer's service truck was there. 2 days after that, a heavy-duty wrecker hauled the big tractor away. The story was all over the co-op a week later. It wasn't a simple breakdown. The main hydraulic pump had failed, sending a cascade of fine metal shavings through the entire closed-center hydraulic system. It had contaminated everything: the steering, the brakes, the transmission clutches, the remote valve bodies. The repair was a complete teardown, a mechanical autopsy that the dealer estimated would cost over $12,000. $12,000. That was more than I'd paid for my entire line of equipment, the Dozer included. Sterling didn't have that kind of cash. With his yields collapsing and his credit line already stretched to the breaking point, the bank refused to extend him anymore. He had to take out a short-term signature loan from a secondary lender, a loan with an interest rate that was nothing short of predatory. It was the first crack in the foundation of his gleaming green empire, a crack that started deep in the guts of his sophisticated modern machine. While his tractor sat in pieces at the dealership, my old Farmall M just kept running. One afternoon, the water pump started to weep. I drove into town, bought a $4 gasket and a tube of sealant, and had it fixed in an hour. The contrast was not lost on me. Sterling's future was held hostage by a computer diagnostic and a team of specialized technicians. My future depended on my own 2 hands and a set of well-worn wrenches. The first tremor of the coming earthquake had passed, and my humble little house, built on a foundation of paid-for iron, was still standing. The real storm hit in 1980. It didn't come as a drought or a flood, but as a quiet announcement from a man in a suit in Washington, D.C. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, declared a grain embargo. Our biggest customer was suddenly gone. The market, which had already been softening, didn't just fall, it plummeted off a cliff. Corn that had been flirting with $3 a bushel was suddenly worth $2. Soybeans cratered. The entire economic logic of the 1970s evaporated overnight. It was a bloodbath. But it got worse. To combat the runaway inflation that had plagued the country, the Federal Reserve, under a new chairman named Paul Volcker, began to aggressively raise interest rates. The prime rate, the number that banks based their own lending on, started to climb. 10%, 12, 15. By 1981, it was over 20%. For men like Richard Sterling, who had financed their expansion on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating notes, the money he borrowed each spring to buy seed and fertilizer, reset at the new astronomical rates. The payments on his land and machinery more than doubled. He was being squeezed from both sides. The value of his crop was cut in half, while the cost of his debt exploded. The mood in the county turned dark and fearful. The easy confidence of the 70s was replaced by a grim, quiet desperation. The talk at the diner was no longer about buying new combines, but about which neighbor had received a foreclosure notice. The smiling bankers, who had once practically thrown money at farmers, now sat behind their desks with cold eyes, talking about restructuring and liquidation. They were no longer partners in prosperity. They were undertakers measuring a corpse for a coffin. I was insulated but not immune. The price I got for my corn was just as low as everyone else's. But I had no debt payments. My input costs were a fraction of Sterling's. I used manure from my cattle to fertilize the fields, reducing my need for expensive commercial nitrogen. My old, smaller equipment used less fuel. And my cattle herd, which I sold directly to a local locker plant, provided a steady stream of cash that wasn't tied to the volatile grain markets. I wasn't getting rich, but my books were balancing. I was surviving. Sterling was not. The first public sign was the for sale sign that appeared on his newest parcel of land, the old Miller place. He was trying to sell assets to cover his debts, but nobody was buying. Land values were collapsing as fast as commodity prices. The very ground that had been his collateral, the foundation of his paper wealth, was turning to quicksand beneath his feet. I saw him one evening at the gas station. He looked 10 years older. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He was putting $5 worth of gas in his pickup truck, paying for it with loose change he counted out onto the counter. He saw me, and for a moment his eyes flared with the old arrogance, but it died just as quickly, replaced by a look of hollow despair. He just nodded, turned, and walked out without a word. The end came in the spring of 1982. The official notice was posted on the courthouse door and printed in the classified section of the county newspaper. An auction. By order of the Oak Valley Savings and Loan, the assets of Sterling Farms were to be sold to the highest bidder. All of it. The land, the house, the gleaming John Deere and Gleaner machines, the grain bins, the workshop tools, everything. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a typical Iowa March day with a bitter wind that cut right through your coat. The crowd was huge, but the mood was funereal. These weren't buyers looking for a bargain, they were neighbors watching a public execution, their faces etched with the terrifying thought that they could be next. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop. Then he moved to the machinery, lined up in a row in the muddy farmyard. The John Deere 4630, its hydraulic system now fully repaired at a cost Sterling could never recoup, looked like a green giant on its dual wheels. But the bids were pitifully low. A machine he'd paid nearly $50,000 for just a few years earlier sold for $12,000 to a dealer from out of state. The massive Gleaner combine went for even less. It was a fire sale, and the bank was holding the matches. I stood at the back of the crowd, just as I had at that other auction years ago. I wasn't there to gloat. I felt a profound sadness, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. This was more than just one man's failure. It was the death of a dream that had seduced an entire generation of farmers. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the land. It was sold off in parcels. The Miller place. The quarter section to the north. Piece by piece, Sterling's empire was dismembered. The last parcel to be sold was the original 80 acres, the piece of ground his grandfather had homesteaded, the land where his house and barns stood. The bidding was slow. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $1,000 an acre. A speculator from the city bid $1,100. Someone else bid $12. It stalled there. The banker stood with his arms crossed, his face a grim mask. He needed more to satisfy the debt. I thought of Sterling, sitting inside the house with his family, listening as his entire world was sold off, piece by piece. I thought of his arrogance and his mockery, but I also thought of his ambition, his belief in a future that had betrayed him. He had been wrong, and I had been right. But there was no victory in it, only sorrow. I stepped forward. The crowd parted slightly, murmuring. 1,500, I said, my voice clear and steady in the cold air. The speculator looked at me, then at the auctioneer, and shook his head. The auctioneer's gavel cracked, a sharp final sound that echoed off the silent barn. Sold, to Jed Stone. I had bought the heart of my rival's farm. I didn't go to the house. I went to the bank the next day and signed the papers. My war chest, the money I had saved during the boom years, was more than enough to cover the cost. I paid in cash. The banker, the same man who had once called me to his office to tell me I was underutilizing my assets, shook my hand with a new, sober respect. "You were wise, Mr. Stone," he said quietly, "wiser than all of us." 2 days later, I drove my old Ford down Sterling's driveway. He came out of the house as I pulled up. He looked defeated, a ghost haunting the grounds of his own life. He thought I had come to evict him. "Stone," he said, his voice raspy, "come to watch the show? Come to throw me out yourself?" "No, Rich," I said, getting out of the truck. I held out a piece of paper. It wasn't an eviction notice, it was a lease agreement. "I'm here to offer you a deal. I'll rent you the house and the barns for $100 a month. And I'll rent you the 80 acres for a third of the crop, just like any other tenant." He stared at the paper, then at me, his eyes filled with disbelief and confusion. "Why?" he finally choked out. "After everything, why would you do this?" I looked out over the fields, the same fields he had looked at with so much pride. Because this land is your family's land, I said. It should be farmed by a sterling. The bank is a cruel master, Rich. I know you understand that now. I'd rather be a good neighbor. He didn't say anything. He just took the paper, his hand trembling slightly, and a single tear traced a path through the dirt on his cheek. It was the only victory speech I ever needed. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a changed landscape behind. The farmers who survived were the ones like me, diversified, debt-averse and cautious. The get-rich-quick mentality of the 70s was gone, replaced by a deep-seated respect for sustainability and fiscal discipline. Rich Sterling became a good tenant. Freed from the crushing weight of the bank, he rediscovered a love for the simple act of farming. He sold his big pickup and bought an old, reliable Chevrolet. He started a small hog operation, and his wife began selling produce at the farmers' market in town. They worked hard, and slowly they began to rebuild. We were no longer rivals, but neighbors in the truest sense of the word. We'd help each other during planting and harvest, sharing labor and machinery. Two men who had learned the same lesson from opposite ends of the classroom. My own farm prospered in its quiet way. The cattle herd grew. The reclaimed land on the back 80 proved to be some of my most productive ground, its terraced contours holding the water and soil that the windswept flatlands lost. I never became the biggest farmer in the county, and I never cared to be. My wealth wasn't measured in acreage or bushels, but in the peace of mind that came with owning everything free and clear. I eventually married a schoolteacher from town, a woman who understood the value of a quiet life and a hard day's work. We had a son, and we named him Thomas, after my father. One warm summer evening, when Tom was about 10 years old, I found him out by the machine shed. He was standing beside the old Alice Chalmers HD6. It hadn't been used in years, but I could never bring myself to sell it. Its yellow paint was almost completely faded to a pale, chalky primer, and streaks of rust bled from its seams, but it still stood there, solid and imposing. "Dad," Tom asked, running his small hand over the cold steel of the blade, "is it true what Mr. Sterling says, that you built half the farm with this old thing?" I smiled and walked over to stand beside him. "It's true," I said. "This old Dozer and we spent a lot of time together." I looked out from that spot, my son beside me. I could see the shimmering surface of the pond in the distance, the gentle green slopes of the pasture, and the neat contoured rows of corn on the reclaimed land. Beyond that, I could see the roof of Rich Sterling's house, a curl of smoke rising from his chimney. "Your grandfather, my dad, he taught me something very important," I said. Putting my hand on Tom's shoulder, "He taught me that debt is a chain. It can feel light at first, but it gets heavier with every step. This Dozer," I patted the massive track, "it looks like a pile of junk to some people, but to me it's a symbol of freedom. I paid for it with my own money. Every hour it ran, every tree it pushed over, every scoop of dirt it moved, it was working for me, not for a bank." Tom looked from the Dozer to the land, his young mind trying to piece it all together. "The world will tell you to get bigger, to go faster, to borrow money to buy the newest and the shiniest things," I continued, my voice quiet. "And sometimes that might even look like it's working. But the soil doesn't care about shiny paint, it cares about patience. And a man's freedom doesn't come from a big line of credit. It comes from owning his own tools, his own land, and his own soul." He nodded, a serious look on his face. He was beginning to understand. We stood there for a long time as the sun set, the long shadows of the barn and the old Dozer stretching out across the land. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut hay and the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. It was the smell and sound of a life built not on borrowed money or fleeting market highs, but on the solid, unyielding foundation of hard work, good sense, and 10 tons of old, paid-for American iron.